People were ruined. People were bankrupted. People were imprisoned. There were atrocious miscarriages of justice. People died. The greatest horrors of the world, man's cruelty to man, are not caused by monsters, malfunctions, or misfortune, but by those who claim to act in the name of good, enforcing a perverted vision of order that leaves no room for dissent. Cruelty has a human heart. The truth is that this tragedy, as Mr. Beer has said, is not about an IT system. Horizon did not destroy the innocent. The malignant culture of the post office did. The post office's inveterate contempt for the subpostmasters, its corrosive prejudice against them, its desire for absolute control over them was the incubator for these terrible events. The seeds of this tragedy lie in the misappropriation of Horizon as a weapon of domination. Voltaire's words come to mind. Those who can make you believe absurdities would have you commit atrocities. The absurdity was the belief that cascaded from the top down, from the board and the executive to the auditors and the investigators, that Horizon was incapable of generating shortfall errors. It was infallible. There were no bugs. And when they were caught in that lie, they used this mantra instead. It was robust, with a few minuscule exceptions or anomalies. The subpostmasters' plaintive cries for help were dismissed. They were stigmatized as troublemakers, incompetents, or dishonest. And they were then isolated and silenced with a lie. It's you. It's only you. You're the only one complaining about a problem. There's nothing wrong with the system. Such heartlessness came from the top. They did not listen because Horizon was not rolled out to make balancing easier for the subpostmasters, but as a means to annex their accounts, deprive them of all autonomy, and to exert a degree of totalitarian control. It was as if Horizon was its faithful spy for the post office at every branch and every counter, reporting accurately everything back to HQ. The annexation of their accounts, their being denied access to the constituent data, and ultimately the removal of their right to challenge the figures was a modern form of corporate tyranny. Horizon had become a false god. The atrocities that followed were the inevitable consequence of enforcing that dogma. People were ruined. People were bankrupted. People were imprisoned. There were atrocious miscarriages of justice. People died. Whether the board and the executive knew of these injustices from the start is an irrelevant diversion. They ought to have known or appreciated that by refusing to countenance the possibility that Horizon might generate shortfall errors, they had created a terrible risk. It was a recipe for certain disaster. By the time they realized that terrifying injustices had been inflicted in their name, they had a choice. But they closed their minds and closed ranks around the system. There was a culture of contempt, ridicule, even hatred towards the subpostmasters and their complaints. Former SPADs derided the subpostmasters' allegations as, quotation, the self-indulgence of a number of malcontents to the detriment of our customers. SPMs, another SPAD said, had lifestyle difficulties. So-called investigators boasted of retaining documents in breach of the Data Protection Act, quotation, to prove there's no effing case for the justice of thieving subpostmasters. They were all crooks. And of course, like all culture, the prejudice was top-down. Paula Venables piously professed her disagreement with the instinct of her predecessor, Alan Cook, when he said that subbies with their hands in the till choose to blame the technology when they're found short of cash. But in 2014, Miss Venables was to write disdainfully, despite, because of course, sir, it was 2014, despite all she then knew, that she was more bored than outraged by the sub-postmaster's complaints. Those who lack interest, let alone curiosity about the world beyond their own notions of order, often lack compassion for others and become devoid of empathy. This typified the attitude and prejudices of the board, the executive, and even Whitehall during this dreadful epoch. It similarly applies to the lawyers, internal and external, who enforce this corporate psychopathy with ingenuity, ruthless disregard for ethical norms, and even deceit. This terrible story reflects badly on almost every aspect of our society and causes us to question everything that we believed in previously about Britain. But you appreciate this already, sir, and I'm conscious that addressing you now at the end of years of evidence is about as useful as me presuming to teach a dolphin how to swim. You know your own mind, and it is not for me to tell you what to conclude or how to think. But you have asked this question more than once: is the post office worth saving? And to answer that question, I refer to another mammal. Has the leopard changed any of its spots? Whether the post office is worth saving must depend on whether it has changed, or is its character, so often malignant and vindictive, immutable. What is the test, sir? Compensation, righting past wrongs, however belatedly, is surely the yardstick by which you, sir, shall judge whether the post office has really reformed itself. Unfortunately, the conduct of compensation, as you have seen, tells you that the leopard has not changed its spots and remains both cunning and dangerous. Its conduct of compensation reveals that the post office's reprehensible traits are not historic or past, but very much alive and continue to poison the process. The post office's dirty tricks still continue, for all it says to the contrary, because the post office is not what it says, but what it does. And look at what it is doing now. Its technocratic demands for 5 expert medical reports concerning Janet Skinner's disability reflects its adversarial, robotic disdain for its victims. Its heartless rejection of Gowrie Jayakanthan's claim for compensation mirrors its cruel humiliation of her late husband. Her entire claim was rejected based on a technicality. It echoes the approach you saw during the GLO steering group meeting of the 11th of September 2017, in which 3 strategies were advanced to, I quote, force the claimants into a position where they give up or settle. One was called thinning the herd, which has a neat, dehumanizing touch, does it not? I quote from the document: thin the herd. We've identified various types of claimant that might be facing procedural problems that could see them struck out. Claimants who are dissolved companies, claimants who are bankrupt or deceased. The way the post office is treating Gowrie Jayakanthan today was foretold in this GLO document, which is now 7 years old. They're thinning the herd. The mindset remains the same. And the post office was thinning the herd with its ludicrous demands for contemporaneous documents, wasn't it? Despite knowing that it had locked sub-postmasters out of their own premises, denying them access to their own documents, and even shredding them. This requirement for contemporaneous documents during the compensation process reveals that the post office will put up any obstacle to evade, minimize, or delay proper restitution. And that it crafted this process not more than a few months after the Common Issues judgment, which outlined its appallingly one-sided reverse burden of proof denial of documents to the sub-postmasters. The fact that it crafted this process predicated on such demands for contemporaneous documents shows that it continues to manipulate as cynically and as offensively as ever. And you will not forget, sir, that it was a Mr. Underwood who made that calculated suggestion concerning contemporaneous documents to limit applications. I will return to Mr. Underwood later in another context if I have time, but he typifies the mindset of manipulation, and the mindset remains the same. The duplicitous arrogance that animated the aggressive litigation before Mr. Justice Fraser, before a jury at Guildford Crown Court in 2010, and before His Honour Judge Havery, just off Fetter Lane in 2006 to 2007, has now been superseded by a compensation process that is pettifogging, legalistic and cruelly slow. Bogged down by attritional bureaucracy, many claimants surrender, for that is what attrition does. You give up. You take the miserly offer you're given and do not settle for what you truly deserve. People, as we have heard today, have died, and more will die without proper, let alone prompt, redress. They're worn out by schemes that are cynically devised and brutally operated. And so, therefore, some may take the cash, not because it's fair or full, but because they can no longer face the battle. And this is a Dickensian process. Legal technicalities devoid of merit are taken on a whim by the Post Office. You'll have seen in the codicil to our written submissions reference to the grossly unmeritorious clawback ploy the Post Office attempted, which Lord Dyson roundly rejected. These spurious claims were driven by the Post Office's dictatorial belief in its own sense of entitlement. They believed that they were entitled to grasp back these modest sums which the subpostmasters had agreed between themselves and which had nothing to do with the Post Office. The mindset remains the same. So was this not the behaviour described by Lord Justice Coulson when rejecting leave to appeal after the Common Issues judgment, when stating that the Post Office's application, and I quote, is founded on the premise that it was not obliged to treat their sub-postmasters with good faith, and instead entitled to treat them in capricious or arbitrary ways which would not be unfamiliar to a mid-Victorian factory owner. That memorable phrase sums up not only the Post Office's grotesque imbalance of power, but also its unshakable belief in its own entitlement.